I'm going to be working with the following materials to sew this gown, and I chose blue as my color palette. The first material here is this navy blue lace that has a floral and checkered combination design that just looks really beautiful over this baby blue lining. I thought using a matching lining would make it a bit dark, so I decided to brighten it up with the baby blue lining, which I got 2 meters of each. I also have a long blue invisible zip for the gown, as well as matching thread. For the illusion mesh, I've mentioned and I've shown this mesh in a previous video, which I would link down below. It has a bit of stretch, which was perfect for what I wanted it to do, and it goes really well with my complexion. I bought about 5 meters in case I need it in the future, but you only need about half a meter for this dress design. If you haven't seen the pattern tutorial already, I'm going to link it down below, so you go check that out first before coming back to watch how to put this gown together. So I've gone ahead and I've pinned down my mesh pattern onto the mesh fabric itself, and because I don't want to hem the arm and neckline of this mesh, I'm very careful cutting it along the neckline and around the armhole especially. So for the main gown itself in this navy blue lace, I have gone ahead and I've pinned it down in such a way that I maximize the use of my fabric. I got 2 meters of this navy lace and I didn't even finish it, so I say 1.5 meters works for you depending on how tall you are and how much volume you want the bottom of your gown to be. So I'm just going ahead to cut out my different panels, the front as well as the back, so I can go ahead and notch the necessary points that would make my life a lot easier when I'm actually sewing everything together, because the more panels you have, the more important notches actually become, because they tell you what side is the front, what side is the back, where your bust line is, and what pieces should go together. So these are all of my pieces cut down here, ready to be joined together. I have my mesh pieces for the back as well as the front. The back, you would need 2 separate panels that you would join together along the shoulders, and for the front you need 1 piece cut on a fold. As for your main lace material, I just went ahead to cut out my front panels as well as my back, remembering to cut my notches as well. For the lining, you're going to need 2 sets. The first set has to be sort of almost the same length as your main blue lace, and then the second set was a little bit shorter because I ran out of fabric, but you have the freedom to make it even longer for the lining of the gown. So I'm going to go ahead and join my front panels together, and I like to always, when I'm sort of working with transparent or like see-through lace, I like to always join the lining to the panels on like a 0.5 seam allowance first, because it just makes it one piece that I can join together to complete the garment. This is optional. You have the choice to sort of like join them in layers of 4 in one seam, but what happens if anything moves, you really can't go back to change it except on picking the entire seam. So now that we have our front panels sort of like joined along the edges on the 0.5 seam allowance, we can go ahead and join them along these sort of mid nipple seams here. So I'm just going ahead to pin together my front panels in place, so by the time I sew this up all together, I have 1 piece for the front of the gown that we can join to the back to make it a complete garment. So I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to be sewing on a 1 centimeter seam allowance from the beginning all the way to the end. And because we sort of already joined, in quotes, the navy lace to the light blue lining, I don't have to think very much when I'm stitching them together. I know they are sort of connected and will stay put as I sew along. So I went ahead to press my seams nice and flat, so I know this is ready to be joined to my back, and this is what the front looks like at this point in time. Moving on to the back, we're going to be sewing the darts. Starting with the lace panels, I'm going to grab my pattern piece and pin through the dart point onto the actual fabric itself. So this is a method that I just find easy and straightforward to do, because once you pass the pins through, you can lift the paper up slightly and then mark the points with a chalk, and then you can just pin those points together ready to sew. So I'm going to flip this over to this side here, and I'm just going to mark with my chalk on the top, the sides, as well as the bottom point of my dart. Then I'm going to lift the paper so I can mark the top layer or the layer directly underneath the pattern paper. So I know I've marked both layers of my lace back of the gown, and then I can go ahead and mark the lining for the inside, as well as the lining that sort of conceals the see-throughness of this lace. So I'm just going ahead to pin my points together. If there's another sort of quicker method that you guys know, please share it down below, so we cannot grow and evolve together. But I'm just going in here to pin this top end of my dart like so. I'm going to repeat the same on the other side, and then I know I can take this to my machine and sew with a regular straight stitch from the beginning all the way till the end. I've gone ahead to pin my lining piece as well. This is a longer lining that we're going to be using directly underneath the lace. And I say the thing I've learned from sewing fine fabrics like this and the mesh is working with a lower tension prevents the stitch from gathering up your fabric. So tensions of like 4 or 3 always sort of worked. So I went ahead to sew the lining darts and I ironed everything nice and flat so I can join them together along the sides like we did with the front panels. So I'm going to put corresponding sides together like so, and it doesn't matter that you can see this dart on this end because the other set of lining would conceal this on the inside later on. So I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to be sewing all the way around, joining the light blue lining to the navy blue lace on a 0.5 seam allowance. You can also use a zigzag stitch on the end. The aim is just to make both layers stay put, so when you're sewing them during the entire process of the construction, they don't actually move out of place, because the thing with like very nice fine fabrics is they slip and they slide very, very easily. So now that we've stitched up both back panels, we can go ahead and join them together to the main front panel that we did earlier on. And we're going to be joining them together along the side seams, that's for the left and for the right hand side. So we have one piece of your main outer shell ready to be connected to your mesh layer as well as your lining layer on the inside. So I'm sewing now on a 1 centimeter seam allowance using a normal straight stitch on fairly regular tension because this is a slightly thicker seam. I'm going to do this for the left and for the right hand side. Just take your time sewing because you want it to turn out really, really nice and good. After that, I went ahead to overlock all my seams to make sure they're nice and tidy. And I just pinned on the dress without adding the illusion mesh line to check that everything sort of fits all right. And I'm so happy with the neckline. I've always struggled getting this sweetheart neckline and bust point to look at how even that cup even is. Like, I'm just wearing a strapless bra underneath because I didn't want to put like an inbuilt corset, which is something that you could consider doing if you don't want to wear a strapless bra. But this just looks so good. I could almost just even finish off the dress like this if I wasn't going for the whole illusion neckline concept. But how gorgeous is that? Even if I don't wear this dress for my upcoming like occasion in December, and now I can wear it for one of like the rehearsal dinner days for my white wedding next year. I'm actually really, really happy. Wow, what do you guys think? Now that we have the outer shell sorted, I'm going to go ahead and join the lining panels for the front together first along this mid nipple seam. After doing that, I went ahead to press my seams nice and flat, and I'm going to go ahead and sew the darts for the back lining so we can join them all together along the side seam. So now that we have the back darts done as well as our front panels joined together, I'm going to put put the left side of the front to the left side of the back so we can join the side seams for both the left and the right hand side of the garment. So this is going to become the sort of main lining that you use to finish up the neckline and the zip on the center back. So I'm going to be sewing this up on a 1 centimeter seam allowance using lower tension because this lining was actually very fine, but the great thing about it is it's anti-static, so it wouldn't stick to my body when I actually wear the gown later on. So I'm going to do this for the left and for the right hand side, give it a nice press and then set it to the side while I work on the mesh panels. For the mesh panel, the first thing you need to do is you need to join them along the shoulders, and because of how really transparent and see-through this type of mesh is, I decided to go for a French seam, which is basically when you stitch a seam twice. So you put the shoulders or the garments together on the right side and then you stitch it on a 0.5 seam allowance, and then you turn it together, or so you sort of like fold it over the other way like so, and then you stitch it again on a 0.5 seam allowance. And this sort of like second stitching you do on the wrong side of your garment, so when you look both on the inside and on the outside you don't see any raw edge along the seam. This is something that really looks really good on like lace and mesh and chiffon and silks. Any fabric that is very nice and delicate, French seams actually look really good on them. After that, I went ahead to press down my seams to just relax them nice and flat, and I'm going to grab my outer shell or the main gown, and we're going to be joining the mesh panel onto the main gown along the neckline. I think this is where the real work of the dress is. So starting from that center front point, you want to align the sharpest point of your mesh to that the deepest point of your sweetheart neckline, and pinning together the notched points along the nipple seam. I'm pinning together also where the side seam ends for both the back and the front armhole, and I overlapped them slightly by about 1 centimeter. And then I'm also pinning along that sort of back neckline all the way to the center back edge. I repeated the same thing on the other side, and once you're sort of happy and you've pinned it all in place, you can go ahead and stitch this all together. The one thing I would say is mesh is very delicate, very fine, and it moves very easily, and because of where this particular seam sits, any mistake made will show. Mine wasn't even very perfect. The only way I could get away with that is because my boobs just stretched out the gathering that was made, but you need to join this mesh onto the neckline of your gown on about 0.5 seam allowance. I actually ended up sewing on 1 centimeter and ended up with a seam allowance that was even wider, so just keep that in mind while you do your own sewing. So as you approach that sweetheart point in front, you gradually would stretch the edge of your mesh to match the edge of your actual gown neckline, and then when you reach that middle point, you leave your needle in, turn it the other way, drop that footer again, and continue to sew. Just remember that whatever gathering or whatever sort of like ill-fitting points that doesn't really like lay flat even after pressing will show on the right side or on the outside of your garment. So this is what the seam looks like so far. I really should have stitched this on a 0.5 seam allowance, but you guys would learn from my mistakes. But this is what it looks like at this point, and because I almost nailed that sort of sharpest point in the neckline, it looks really good actually. So once you're done with that, you can go ahead and sandwich your shorter lining to finish off this seam that we just made. So I'm going to grab the lining and pin it together along the neckline, so we have the mesh layer in between the main gown and this light blue lining that we can see here. Alright, so I am about to sandwich the mesh in between the main panel and the lining, and something I just wanted to mention is the fact that since these layers are different colors, like that's navy blue, this is light blue, and the mesh is like dark brown. You would need to change the color of your cotton so it matches what side of the fabric you're sewing. So for this particular layer, I had to change the thread back to this navy one, this light blue one, because I used this brown shade to stitch in the mesh to the neckline of the main shell. So just remember to be changing your cotton as you sew along. I don't know, it's just good practice and something that I picked up while I was studying. So I'm going to crack on and join the lining to the neckline of the dress. So I'm sewing in my shorter lining into the neckline of the gown, sandwiching my mesh panel underneath like so, and I tried to stitch on the exact same line, but that was almost impossible to do. So if I had done that mesh seam a lot narrower, this would have been easier for me, but just keep that in mind. So I'm just turning around to the other side of my sweetheart neckline on the front, working my way to that underarm area and all the way to the back. Just remember to end your stitch 1 inch before your center back seam on both sides. This would allow you fix in your zip later on. So I'm just going in to trim off any threads or excess fabric and flip over to check to see how my progress is going so far. So far so good. This is what it looks like, and that sort of inner lining really helped to finish off this particular part of the garment really nicely. So I'm going to go in again and do an edge stitch that is going to tuck the lining inside and allow the mesh line to really stand nice and neatly on its own. So you would only need to sew the lining to the seam allowance of the garment, so you don't stitch the main blue lace sort of layer. You only stitch the lining to that seam allowance on about 0.25 or 0.5. It's a really tiny edge stitch, and you can take your time doing this because it's something that will show on the inside of the garment, but it looks really nice and neat when it's sort of like done correctly. So I'm going to work my way all the way to the other end, remembering to end 1 inch before that center back seam. So I went ahead to press down all of my seams to check and see, and this looks really good. For the fact that it's the first time I've done this sort of neckline, I'm actually so proud of myself. I'm so proud, and I'm so happy, and I know by the third time I'm doing this to look even nicer. So now once I'm happy with the neckline and the progress so far, I can go ahead and fix my zip on the center back of the gown. Next up, we're going to fix the invisible zip into the open center back seam of the gown, and I like to undo the zip and start with one side when I'm sort of sewing invisible zips into seams. So if it's optional, you don't have to, but I like to put like a pin on both sides so that guides me when I'm actually sewing. So starting with one side, I'm going to be sewing into that center back edge using my narrow zip footer that allows me to get really close to that zip teeth, so when the zip is done it looks invisible like the name goes. So I'm stitching all the way down to the bottom, doing my back stitch, and I'm going to turn to the other side to fix it into the other side of the back of the gown. So once I reach the top, I'm going to do my back stitch to secure that and zip it all the way to check that they're symmetrical and they finish off at the same point on the top of that back neckline. So once you're happy with that, you can go ahead and close up that sort of bottom back seam on this area, which is sort of like below your zip, and you sew this on a 1 centimeter seam allowance from the top all the way to the bottom and give it a nice press, and this is what it should look like. To finish off this center back seam or zip edge, we're going to fold over corresponding sides, pin them together and stitch them up in such a way that they conceal the edge of the zip seam, and when it's joined up along the bottom you don't see any seams on the center back of the garment, even on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and fold over this side, opening my zip to give me easy access, and starting from that top of that back neckline that we didn't stitch up, we're going to sort of join this shorter lining to that center back seam along the edge that we stitched in our zip, and we're going to be using our narrow footer as well, because that allows you to sort of stitch up in a way that flows easily because it's a slimmer foot. So I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to sew all the way from the top of that neckline, turn my way downwards, and then sew from the top all the way to the bottom. I'm going to do this for the left and for the right hand side. So when you turn this inside out, you wouldn't see any raw seams on the neckline or the center back of your gown. So now sewing on a 1 centimeter seam allowance, I'm making my way down on this end of our zip. You want to sew about 0.25 centimeters away from the seam that joins the zip onto the center back of your gown. So I'm making my way downwards like so, remembering to do my back stitch once I reach the end of this particular seam. So I'm going to do this for the left and for the right hand side before joining together this open end that is beneath the zip for the shorter lining on the inside of the garment. Now sewing on a 1 centimeter seam allowance, I'm just quickly joining together this open end like so, up until the point that the zip sort of like ends. So when you do your zip all the way to the end, you don't see any holes or opening at the bottom. Once that is done, the last step to do is to hem all your edges, so the hem of the lining on the inside and the hem of your main gown to finish off this dress. So once that is done, your gown is complete. This took me about 3 days to make because I was doing it in between other things in my life, but it was a real learning experience. I had decided to take my time because I wanted to do it right, and because I wanted you guys to sort of see and enjoy the full process of making a gown that looks like this. It looks really simple, really elegant, but anything that looks good is done well. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I would link any relevant tutorials, tools necessary down below, and until my next video, have a good morning, afternoon and evening wherever you are. Bye.